Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, then go ahead and copy and paste your question onto the bottom of this Patreon post. And also don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer them in order of how many likes they have. And don't forget to post any new questions that you have as well. Also, I'll just say up front, the reason why the microphone is in the screen a little bit is because they're doing construction outside. It's pretty noisy. You'll probably hear it to some degree anyway, so I really apologize if things don't sound too great. But yeah, in order to reduce how much you guys hear that construction outside, I'm having the mic be as close to my face as possible, and then I'm turning down the sensitivity of the mic more than usual. And so as a side effect of that might be that I pop some of my P's. So if that also sounds annoying, I apologize for that as well. But I assume it's going to be better than hearing construction sounds. So yeah, today there was actually 3 different questions related to my friend who I've been mentioning on the last few couple Q&As, who got really fluent in Japanese through listening alone without doing any reading, without doing any Anki. So this person I am going to be interviewing pretty soon on my channel. If it's not the next video I release, it might be the one after that. So yeah, to all you guys who are really curious about how this friend that I have was able to learn without any Anki or anything, we'll be going into great detail on that in the interview, so you guys can look forward to that. But just to give a little bit of a summary and kind of answer some of the specific questions that were asked, from my understanding, he first of all was doing a ton of immersion. I think he said he was doing like 10+ hours a day, so he was really doing this full time. It was when he was in high school, I believe, so kind of similar to me. He just dedicated his entire life to learning Japanese. And he also did have, he did really limit the domain. I think he learned mostly from anime, specifically shonen anime. For the first couple years, I think that was all he was watching. And I think he would do this thing where he would first watch an anime episode with the English subtitles on, and then he'd watch that same episode again without any subtitles. And I think he went through all of One Piece this way, like multiple times, like all of One Piece, all, 800, 900 episodes, however many existed at the time. Less than now, but yeah, he went through the entire thing multiple times. So yeah, this friend has an ability to just do insane repetition without getting bored. That's kind of his personality. I'm jealous. I wish I had that ability. It's really good for language learning. So he did go really intensely, and I think he was looking up words as well as they came up as he heard them. So it wasn't like he didn't use a dictionary, but yeah, he never really made flashcards or did Anki or anything. So yeah, that's the gist of it. Pretty intense, but I think, yeah, there's a lot that we can all learn from the way that he learned. And yeah, hopefully, we haven't actually filmed the interview yet or anything, so I'm looking forward to getting to interview him as well. And then one question that is kind of related to what I just talked about, but still different. I'll like read the full question. So Hayden asks, you've mentioned before that you have a friend who learned Japanese only through listening, and because of this, this friend has developed a great pitch accent and great listening abilities. I think you've also said that you developed some bad habits. Sorry, he's writing about me in the 3rd person, so I'm like changing it to 2nd person as I go, and that's why I keep messing up. I'll just read it how it is. I think Matt has also said he developed some bad habits in pitch accent because he was so reading dominant. I'm also in the same boat and reached basic fluency in Japanese mainly through reading, and I also feel like I developed some bad habits, especially when it comes to pitch accent and listening. I was wondering if I stopped reading and just did listening for many years, would I be able to reverse those bad habits that I gained? Also, would I be able to get the same benefit as somebody who started out just listening? In another way of asking, do you know anyone who has switched from being reading dominant to being listening dominant and had any success? Lastly, if it's not too much, can you share what your friend's process? Oh yeah, so I already kind of did this part. But yeah, first of all, I'll say, yeah, my friend, just from the way that he learned, before he put any active effort into improving his pitch accent was really good. Like, way better than mine was before I started working on pitch accent. But it wasn't perfect, and he did in these last couple years spend a lot of time actively improving his pitch accent, and now he's like, I don't think he's perfect, but he's definitely closer to perfect than me. And so yeah, it wasn't like learning through listening was a magic pill to let him 100% get perfect pitch accent, but it definitely got him way closer off the bat. And I also think his process of ironing out the kinks that did exist in his pitch accent overall was a lot smoother and a lot quicker than it was for me, because from a pitch accent perspective, I kind of really had to start from scratch when I started actively working on my pitch accent. But yeah, in terms of, you know, switching from reading dominant to listening dominant, to be honest, I think this is really challenging. This is something that I still struggle with, and for these past couple years, I have been doing way more listening than reading, yet although things maybe have improved a little bit, it hasn't really gotten close to fully reversing. I think the reality is the way that you learn a language the first time has permanent effects on the way that the language is structured in your brain, and it's just really hard to change that, right? Like, I think of it as the first version of the language that you learn, or the first way that you learn the language, forms the kind of foundation of that language in your head, and everything else you do builds on top of that foundation. So it's really hard to go back and change what the actual foundation is, because afterwards you're kind of just adding things on top, you know? It's really hard to be fluent in a language and then go back and change some fundamental aspect of how the language is structured in your brain. And so, yeah, I think even if you, once you're really reading dominant and you already have reached basic fluency, you could probably do nothing but listening for, you know, 5+ years. And although things would improve for you, like your accent would get better, your listening abilities would get stronger, I don't know if you can ever become truly listening dominant. Like for me, that hasn't been my experience. And so, yeah, it's kind of unfortunate, but it's just kind of the reality for now. I mean, there are some exercises, actually some specific pronunciation exercises that I've been learning more about, called chorusing. I mentioned it a bit in the past. I'm still like looking into it myself. I think also there's another question where I was thinking later on in this Q&A, I was thinking I might bring this up again. But yeah, it's a kind of specific version of shadowing that apparently is really effective for helping you develop your perception and kind of tune up your mouth and your tongue and your ears to the phonetic system of your target language. And so I think doing this exercise could also help people get some, or basically not suffer as badly from the effects of being reading dominant, but it's still something that I'm learning about. So when I feel like I have a more solid understanding, I'll definitely be sharing that with you guys. But for now, yeah, unfortunately, I think the reality is once you become reading dominant, it's really hard to permanently change that. So Timothy Yabuki asks, hey Matt, I have a question about passive immersion. Between school, a nearly full-time job, and other hobbies, I don't have a large amount of time I can dedicate to active immersion daily, other than doing my JP1K flashcards and maybe 5 minutes of a grammar guide every day. However, because my job mostly involves driving, I have a lot of time to dedicate to passive listening. Usually I get in about 6 hours a day. Do you think that this amount of passive listening alone is sufficient to develop listening skills? Or should I start cutting down on time spent on flashcards and the grammar guide to do more immersion? For reference, I'm at stage 1C-ish, so your answer might change for a beginner with less of a foundation. I mean, to be honest, so basically you say that right now all you have time for is 6 hours of passive listening, 6 hours passive listening, and then doing your JP1K flashcards plus 5 minutes of grammar guide. So I don't know how long you're spending doing Anki, but I would guess, you know, between 30 minutes to an hour, right? And so it sounds like you have 30 minutes to an hour of active time and then 6 hours of passive time. And I know you're learning Japanese because you're using the JP1K deck. So to be completely frank, 1 hour of active time and 6 hours of passive hours is really not a lot to make if you're trying to make solid progress learning a language like Japanese. If you're learning a language more similar to your native language, like, you know, obviously you're English speakers, or if you're learning French or Spanish, then things would be different. But in the case of Japanese, it's 1 hour a day is just really not a lot at all. And so the way that I would think about it is, right now you're in a mode where you're building up a foundation and you're building up a lot of potential that later, when you have an opportunity to spend more time per day on Japanese, you'll be able to actualize into actual ability. So you're kind of in this preparation zone where you're going to be putting yourself in a really good position to take advantage of being able to spend more time with Japanese when that point comes sometime in the future. And so in that case, I wouldn't really change what you're doing. I mean, yeah, if you only have an hour a day, then I think, and you're still, you know, a beginner, then, or basically I should just say, what I would recommend doing in your position is what you're doing now. Spend your active time memorizing in as many words as possible, and then do as much passive listening as you can. And the words that you memorize during your active time, you'll be able to practice hearing and understanding when you do the passive listening. And so I do think you'll be able to make pretty solid well, I mean, you'll be able to make progress for sure, but things are probably going to be slow, especially compared to someone who's doing more active immersion. So that's why I would just kind of think of it as, yeah, maybe continue to dedicate all your active time consciously learning words and then doing as much listening as you can. And that way, once you get to some point in your life where you can spend maybe 3-4 hours per day on Japanese, on active immersion, then you'll have a bank of words that you know that you'll be able to activate really quickly, and you'll have a really strong ability to hear all the different sounds of the language because you've spent so much time passively listening. And of course, you should be able to grow your comprehension to some degree just from doing what you're doing now. But yeah, if it's just passive listening and you don't really have time for any active immersion, then things are probably going to be slow. But because of everything I just said, I don't think it would be worth reducing your flashcard time for more active immersion, because even if you're able to get in like 30 minutes of active immersion, that's so little anyway that I don't know how much of a difference it would make, honestly. So it might be better to just use all that time to just be building up your vocabulary so that when you are able to move into a phase where you have more time each day, you can take advantage of that to the fullest. So Luki Dano asks, when I'm reviewing a sentence card and don't immediately get the meaning of the word, but after a few seconds of looking at the context and surrounding words, I figure out what it means and how it's read, is it okay to pass the card, or should I fail it since maybe I'm relying too much on context or remembering the sentence as a whole but not the specific word? Yeah, so the way that I think about this is there's no morality involved in grading cards. There's no, I should do this or I should do that, or it's okay to do this, it's not okay to do that. All you want to think about is what's going to be most effective for your studies. So in the case of the SRS, you're learning how to read and understand the meaning of words so that when you come across those words in your immersion, you understand them. And so if you feel like a word is really blurry in the context of an Anki card and you're only able to get it because the specific sentence that you learned it in reminded you, well, then that probably means that when you come across it in an entirely different sentence in your immersion, you won't be able to recognize it. In which case, the card is not actually meeting the goal that you have for that card, which is to help you recognize and understand the word when you come across it in immersion. So I would just fail the card because that's what's going to be most effective from a study point of view, right? If you fail the card, then it's going to come up again. You're going to relearn it, and you're going to end up knowing it a lot more strongly and clearly than you did before. And then when you come across it in your immersion, you'll probably understand it. So overall, I think that, yeah, if you have cards that are really blurry, failing them is just what's most effective for studying. So that's why I do that. And a couple other points on this is, first of all, you want to make sure that you've changed your Anki settings so that you don't get penalized for failing cards too much. If you use the default Anki settings, the penalty for failing a card is huge. Your interval goes all the way down to 0 on that card, and you have to start again from scratch as if it was a new card. But if you change the new interval after lapse setting in the lapses tab of the option group settings, then you can make it so that, like, for example, if you set it to 50%, that when you fail a card, you still retain 50% of what the original interval was. And that makes it so that failing the card isn't such a big deal. And then again, with ease factors as well, if you're using low-key Anki, then when you fail a card, the ease factor of the card isn't penalized. And so when you combine these two things, the taking away the ease factor penalty and then making it so that the interval isn't going all the way to scratch, it's only reduced by a certain percentage, then failing a card starts to really not be such a big deal. All that happens is the interval gets a little bit shorter, gives you an opportunity to really deepen the memory, and then it'll go back to having a bigger interval again. And by the way, if you're not familiar with Anki settings and things like that, the stuff I just said might have not made any sense, but as long as you copied the exact Anki settings that we put on the Refold website, then you've automatically already implemented everything I just said, so you're good to go. But yeah, the last point I'll make on this question is that, in my experience, if you lean to the side of passing your cards instead of failing your cards, then what can happen over time is that you end up with a lot of cards that you kind of know, but they're blurry. When you have a whole deck filled with cards that you kind of know, but it's blurry, repping is just a real chore because it feels like you're caught in a haze and you have to use so much brain power to get through all your reps. Whereas if you're pretty quick to fail a card as soon as it starts feeling unclear, then you're able to kind of nip it in the butt and fix the issue early on, and then you relearn the word, and then the word is always really easy for you. And so you can end up with a deck of cards that, for the majority of them, you know them really well, and they're all easy for you. And that's what's going to make repping more fun and not such a hassle. So that's why overall, in order to maintain the health of your deck, I think it's important to fail cards that are blurry. It's kind of like how you cut off the dead leaves on a plant, because that keeps the whole plant more healthy, and then it's going to grow more quickly and more healthy and stuff like that. So you want to basically prune all the blurry knowledge in your deck to keep the quality of the whole as high as possible. So Diogo Lamerio asks, hey Matt, I'd like to hear your thoughts on pausing to read a subtitle before versus after a line is spoken when doing intensive immersion. Should only one way be done, or both, depending on language proficiency? So yeah, this is an interesting question. I think you can do it either way. I think the more streamlined way would be to pause before the line is spoken, because, you know, you're watching a show with matching subtitles. If you have it pause before the line is spoken, then you can read it, process it, and then hit play, and then you can hear the sentence pronounced out loud by a native speaker, and you'll be able to probably really hear it or pay attention to that because you already read the sentence, right? So you in the time where the sentence is being spoken, you can give your full attention to listening to the sentence because you already did the work of kind of processing it, right, ahead of time. And on this way, you can just watch through the whole show, pausing once per line, and it'll probably be really smooth. On the other hand, you could make an argument and say that it's actually better to pause after the line is spoken, because that way you don't have to sub-vocalize the sentence with that while having no idea how it really would be pronounced, right? That's the downside of that first way of pausing before the sentence is spoken, is you haven't heard it said yet, so when you read it, you're kind of making up the pronunciation in your head. And again, immediately afterwards, you're getting the correct answer, the correct pronunciation, so it's probably not a big deal, but maybe there's still some argument that you don't want to be reading the sentences without having first heard how a native speaker would pronounce it. So if you pause it afterwards, then you at least have a little model in your head of roughly what it sounds like, so that then when you go to reread it and sub-vocalize it, your sub-vocalization will probably be more in line with how a native would say it. But overall, that method is probably, yeah, a little more clunky, because after you read the sentence, if you want to listen to it again, which a lot of times you probably will, then you'll have to rewind. So now you have to introduce rewinding into your watching process, which is a little more clunky. And so probably, yeah, my preferred way would be, yeah, pause it before, read it, and then hit play, and then you can hear the sentence that you just read pronounced by a native. And although, yeah, you have to sub-vocalize it once on your own, you immediately hear the correct pronunciation. So I don't think there's going to be any meaningful damage being done. So Daniel asks, hey Matt, at the height of your Japanese ability, were you able to listen to Japanese songs and understand all the nuance? Things like double entendres, I think that's how you pronounce that, double entendres, pop culture references, etc. If so, was that a specific skill you had to train, or did it just come naturally over time with more immersion? Also, what are your top 5 favorite Japanese music albums? I need some music recommendations, thanks. Yeah, so for me, I've always loved music, but I've never been someone to really pay attention to lyrics. It's just my personality. Even before I learned Japanese, all my favorite songs, I didn't know any of the lyrics. I could listen to a song like 50 times and I still just would not pick up on any of the lyrics, because for me, my brain just treats the voice as another instrument and completely ignores the meaning of the words. I don't choose to be this way. It's not like I think lyrics don't matter, but that's just how my brain works. And so unless I stop and like read the lyrics, like I find the written version of the lyrics and read them and think about them, my brain just ignores them by default. And even when I try to listen to the lyrics when I'm listening to a song, a lot of times I can't even make out what they're saying in English. So that's where I was coming from with Japanese. And because I've just personally never really been someone that was that interested in lyrics, and never someone that paid attention to lyrics, in Japanese as well, although I listen to a lot of Japanese music and I like a lot of Japanese music, I also still mostly ignore the lyrics. That's just what my brain does. And so every once in a while, when there's a song I'll really like, I will find the lyrics and I'll read them, and then I'll kind of listen to the song while having the lyrics in front of me, and I'll appreciate it that way. But a lot of times, yeah, I just let the lyrics go over my head, and that just happens to me in every language. So yeah, most of the time when I pull up the lyrics and I try to read them, I have no problem understanding them. I don't find that many references in Japanese songs, and even when I don't pull up the lyrics, I probably understand more of Japanese music on average than of English music. And this is probably just because actually Nick mentioned this in my recent interview with him, Nick, the professional singer in Japan. But in general, Japanese people seem to care more about making sure that their music is actually understandable when you listen to it. Whereas a lot of English songs, if you didn't already know what the lyrics were ahead of time, it's like almost impossible to hear for most people. But yeah, so for me, I'm not great at picking up on song lyrics in any language. So yeah, I'm not really a good example, because if you're somebody who in general does pay attention to lyrics in their native language, then probably naturally the same thing will happen to you in Japanese. And I don't think it'll be too hard, honestly. But the other thing with references is that I don't think anyone's able to get 100% of all references in any language, right? In English, I get a lot of references, and this is not limited to music, but on TV shows, YouTube videos, whatever. I get a lot of references in English, and I miss a lot of references in English because everyone has seen different movies, seen different TV shows, and has a different set of knowledge and information about the world. So yeah, it's kind of unrealistic to expect to get every reference in any language, but you can get to the point where you know the vast majority of the references that show up most often. And that will probably happen pretty naturally just by getting a lot of input, doing a lot of immersion in your target language. And in terms of what Japanese music I like, I actually have a playlist on my YouTube channel that's just full of Japanese music that I like. So it's called Holgaku, I think. And yeah, but I don't even have that many playlists on my channel. So if you go to my channel and you go to the playlist section, I don't think you'll have a hard time finding it. So Cheyenne asks, is there anything you would trade your Japanese ability for? Yeah, lots of things. World peace, immortality. We would be here all day if I gave the whole list. Lemony Flavor asks, Refold is clearly more focused and refined than something like AJATT. Do you think the structured nature of Refold for normal busy people, for normal people with busy lives who don't have all day to be focused on their target language, and only spend maybe up to 5 hours or so a day, makes up for the time spent by someone AJATting all day? I always thought of AJATT as being unfocused and somewhat chaotic, and spending 24/7 on the language was essentially taking as much time as possible and seeing what sticks. I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks. Yeah, so just to kind of rephrase the question, because I kind of read it very poorly. So we have AJATT, right? All Japanese all the time, the method that I was really inspired by when I was learning Japanese, which basically says just spend as much time as possible getting input in your target language. And has that, but then doesn't really talk about what type of input is ideal, ratios between different types of input, domains. None of that is covered at all. It's just do anything that's made by natives for natives, and do it 24/7. And then on the other hand, we have Refold, which is saying, okay, well, most people probably aren't going to be doing this 24/7. Most people, yeah, can spend around 5 hours. Maybe some people can spend a lot more than that, but a lot of people, they don't have all day. And so let's try to create a structure that will optimize the input process. So you should do this much Anki, you should choose a domain, you should have free flow immersion versus intensive immersion, and then passive immersion. And we've kind of tried to raise the efficiency at which you're going to be getting input through adding all this structure. So does 5 hours of doing Refold per day give you the same benefit as doing 24/7 AJATT? Well, first of all, it's hard to say because AJATT doesn't specify any structure, everybody's AJATT is going to be different. Some people might do AJATT and just coincidentally, due to the types of input that they're drawn to, they end up doing the same thing that someone doing Refold would be doing, right? Whereas on the other hand, someone doing AJATT might do something super inefficient, like just watch completely incomprehensible content all day or something like that. And so it's hard to really compare Refold to AJATT because Refold is very structured and defined, whereas AJATT is very amorphous and everyone's AJATT process is going to be completely different. And so there is that on the other hand. The other thing is that ultimately, time is the most important factor when we're talking about learning a language. And if you're really spending 24 hours contacting the language, it's really hard to beat that. Even if your efficiency in terms of like what you're immersing with and the type of immersion is not optimized, if you're just listening to the language from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, and then maybe even while you're sleeping as well, like that is just so powerful. It's really hard to beat that. But what I would say is if we're talking about someone who doesn't have all day to spend on the language and yeah, let's say 5 hours, like you said in your question. You only have 5 hours, and we have one person doing Refold for 5 hours a day and one person doing AJATT for 5 hours a day. I definitely think the person doing Refold is going to make significantly faster progress due to that optimization. Because basically, the less time you have per day, the more that optimization matters. The more time that you can just throw at this thing, then in a way, I think the less that the optimization matters, because it's in a way, everything just kind of melts into this mass amount of exposure that can like overpower everything else. So I would say the less time that you have per day, the more important it is to be optimal, and the more that doing Refold is likely to lead to faster progress than doing basically random immersion through AJATT. But if we're talking about, for example, someone doing AJATT 24/7 versus someone doing Refold 24/7, I still think the Refold person would make faster progress on average, because again, it's hard to talk about AJATT because everyone's AJATT process is different. But the difference between the two would probably be less extreme than in the case of 5 hours of AJATT versus 5 hours of Refold. So yeah, although I think Refold's always going to lead to faster progress on average, how much faster it's going to be depends on how much time you're doing per day. The less time you have per day, the more that the optimization is going to make a big difference. But and then, well, I guess I didn't directly answer the question though. So I mean, yeah, ultimately I still think that 24/7, like what's it say, 16 hours of AJATT per day is going to lead to faster progress than 5 hours of Refold. Maybe it's something like maybe when we're talking about 5 hours a day, maybe you can get between like a 40 and 50% efficiency boost by doing Refold over AJATT. Whereas if we're talking about doing 16 hours a day, maybe you get like a 20 to 30% boost in how fast you progress when you're doing Refold versus AJATT. Simple Milk asks, what do you think would be the most optimal way to train and recognize pitch accent patterns? So I actually have a video planned coming up very soon on this very topic, but to give you a summary, basically what you want to do is memorize the most common words in each of the 4 pitch accent patterns, and then whenever one of those words come up in your immersion, you want to listen for the pitch accent pattern of that word and try to hear the word in terms of the pattern. And that's all you have to do. I'm actually kind of doing this right now for Kansai Ben pitch accent, just for fun. I'm studying Kansai Ben pitch accent a little bit. I'm trying to train myself how to hear it because it's totally different than Tokyo pitch accent. It's really interesting. I'm tempted now to go on a long rant about it, but I'll try not to. But yeah, basically what I've done is there's a bunch of common words that I know the pitch accent for in Kansai pitch. And so then I just listen to Kansai Ben, and whenever one of those words come up, I try to hear it in terms of the pattern. So for example, one of the main patterns that they have in Kansai that they don't have in Tokyo is a pattern that starts low and then stays low until the end of the word, and then the end of the word is high. It's actually a little more complicated than that, but you could say that's the gist of it. And so for me, I've noticed that because in standard Japanese, all that matters pitch accent wise is the drop. It doesn't really matter whether the word started high or started low. Sometimes words start high and sometimes words start low, but that has to do with intonation and not pitch accent. And so for me, I've noticed that because I've always trained myself to hear Tokyo pitch accent, my brain doesn't pay too much attention to whether the word started high or started low, because it doesn't matter in Tokyo pitch accent. My brain only pays attention to the drop. So when I listen to Kansai pitch, I can pick up on the drops really clearly, but then I'll notice that I'll hear a drop and then I'll go, oh, what pattern was that? And then I'll realize, oh, well, that depends on whether it started high or started low. And then I'll realize, oh, my brain didn't pay any attention to that. So I have to rewind and then listen to see, did it start high or low? And so basically, yeah, when one of the words that I know the pitch accent, when I'm listening to Kansai Ben, when one of the words that I know the pitch accent to comes up, what I'll do is say, okay, this was one of the words that's supposed to be like low, low, high. Was it actually low, low, high? And then I'll listen for that. I'll rewind and try to hear it. And then sometimes I can hear it, sometimes I can't. But what happens when you continue to do this is, like basically when you first learn about the pitch accent patterns and you read about the pitch accent patterns, you build a kind of model in your head of what you think each pattern sounds like. But the model that you build is going to be pretty off compared to the actual reality of it. Additionally, depending on the intonation pattern and the emotionality of the sentence, that each pitch accent pattern can show up in a little bit of a different way. And so what happens is right now you have this one version of each pitch accent pattern in your head, which is a one single thing. It's a little bit off. It doesn't take into account how things change with emotionality and stuff like that. And so then at first you can't pay attention to it or you can't notice it in your immersion. But if you keep basically doing this exercise of when a word comes up that you know the pitch to, you try to hear the word in terms of the pitch. You're basically telling your brain, okay, this, you know, that like in my case, oh, you know that low, low, high pattern? This is actually what it sounds like. So I'll listen to it, and yeah, maybe it'll sound different than what I thought it would sound like. But I know that this word is low, low, high, so then I can kind of feed that input into my brain. And as I keep doing that, my brain starts to get all these different, you know, subtly different versions of the low, low, high pattern, and eventually it will click like, okay, now I got like the essence of the low, low, high pattern. I know exactly what it is. It's almost kind of like how you would train a machine learning algorithm, right? Like if you have a machine learning algorithm and you want to train it to be able to tell whether a picture is of a cat or of not of a cat, then you just feed it tons of pictures of cats and of not cats, and you give it you have it guess, and then you give it feedback, right? So you're basically just giving yourself feedback every time you hear one of the words that you know, and then see whether it sounds like the pattern that it's supposed to or not. So yeah, really it just comes down to listening for it in your immersion. And the best way to do this is to, yeah, memorize the pitch of the most common words, because those come up all the time. And then you have lots of opportunities in your immersion to try to hear the pitch accent pattern of these words. And just the act of doing this will help you get better and better and better over time until you get to the point where you hear it automatically, even when you're not actively listening for it. So Rafael de Lima asks, for the past 6 to 7 months of listening every day to Japanese for nearly 16 hours a day, I find that I don't have a problem hearing most things I see in TV shows. However, even with studying Japanese words by frequency nearly every day, I find that I can only understand about 70 to 80% of what is said. The other 30 to 20% I can still hear enough to be able to look up the words, the other 30 to 20% I can still hear enough to be able to look up the words without assistance. Is this normal? Also, do you have any other recommendations for bridging in the rest of the gap, or is the usual Anki sentence mining monolingual translation, maybe meant transition, and immersion sessions all that is needed? Are there other things we can do to bridge the gap to improve comprehension? So first of all, yeah, it's super normal. If you're saying that you understand 70 to 80% and the other 20 to 30%, you can hear the words clearly enough to look them up, but you just don't know them, then it sounds like the biggest thing holding you back is just vocabulary. So in that case, probably you want to emphasize making lots of Anki cards and growing your vocabulary more quickly, because yeah, if what's holding you back is there's just too many words that you don't know, well, the only way to fix that is to learn the words. So if you want to make things move more quickly, then learn more words more quickly, which you can do with Anki, basically. So, of course, you always have to be careful, because if you make too many Anki cards too quickly, that's a really, really good recipe for burnout when your reps start to really pile up. But, so yeah, you got to be wise about that and, you know, play it by ear. But overall, yeah, when you're in this type of situation, you got to first assess what's the biggest thing holding me back, and then think about how can I address that thing that's holding me back. So in this case, I would say sounds like vocabulary is what's holding you back, and in which case learn more vocabulary. There's probably other people who have the opposite problem where, you know, they understand a certain amount, but the stuff that they're missing, it's not because they don't know the words, it's just because they're not hearing the words. Like if they read the subtitles, they understand it, but when the subtitles are off, they don't understand it. In that case, learning more words isn't going to fix the problem, right? In that case, you just got to practice listening more, because it means that you know what's there, but your ear is the problem, right? You're just not being able to pick it out. And there's many other problems that can happen as well. But yeah, basically that's how I kind of think about these types of things. Okay, so this next question is super long. I will read the whole thing, but I also kind of just want to say, in the future, if you guys could try to not have super long questions and maybe just kind of try to boil down your question to the core essence and just write that, it makes it a lot easier to answer, because you know, I have to read this whole thing out loud now, because that's how I do these Q&As, and it does make it a little difficult. But here goes. For reference, I currently reside in China, and I am at stage 4 in learning Mandarin. I can output with accuracy on a range of topics: philosophy, education, history, literature, etc. Currently, my main goals with Mandarin are twofold: to improve my ability to write in these key domains with nuance and eloquence, while at the same time increasing the overall number of domains that I can comprehend and express basic ideas about. As to the second of these goals, increasing the overall number of domains, I believe that you and I are in full accord with how to proceed. Listen and read a lot in these domains. Focus and drill any new vocabulary or grammar that you believe you haven't or won't acquire from immersion. After some time following this routine, begin to carefully output in these domains through writing, finding points of grammar and vocabulary that you have not yet acquired. My set of questions relates to the first of my goals, namely moving from outputting correctly to outputting eloquently. To describe briefly what I mean by eloquent, language that is clear, precise, concise, and fresh/original is eloquent. If I can elaborate further on this definition, please let me know. What I have found in the last half year of writing and being corrected is that very often the corrections I receive are more about stylistics, about which phrasing of a sentence from a variety of idiomatically correct choices sounds best in a given context, rather than grammatical or lexical. Now, at the level of vocabulary and grammar, any 3 or 4 random native speakers should be in agreement as to when they hear something that sounds off. However, once you have reached the level of worrying about stylistics, different native speakers can have widely different views on what sounds right, aka eloquent, and what sounds wrong, aka not eloquent. Furthermore, at this level, most natives often do not signal whether the specific correction they are making is a stylistic choice rather than a grammatical or lexical mistake, which makes identifying true mistakes a pain. Some examples of sentences where I have differing corrections from native speakers are attached below. I'm not going to read this. At this level of language use, how can I go about getting clear feedback which both points out my true mistakes and at the same time pushes me to express my ideas more eloquently? That is, more concisely, precisely, and freshly, by showing me alternative ways of expressing the same idea. My own partial solution has been to get the same piece of writing checked by 2 or 3 different native speakers without telling any of them that I am having the writing corrected by others, and then compare the corrections side by side. Places where all 2 or 3 native speakers changed a given sentence I marked as incorrect, and places where only one native made changes I marked as a stylistic choice on the part of the specific native. This system is not perfect at all, and I would love to hear your input on how to improve it. At this point, would I be better served to forgo corrections by random natives and instead try to find and adopt 1 or 2 natives who are truly eloquent writers in their native language? I have tried to search for such a person in the past, but gave up after contacting 10 to 15 tutors, none of whom could meet my requirements, namely that they write regularly and could send me samples of said writing so that I could read it myself and judge whether I thought their writing was up to standard. So, yeah, I mean, the first thing I wonder is, so it kind of sounds like one of the things that this person's struggling with is when they're getting corrected, figuring out what corrections are stylistic and what corrections are just pure mistakes. But it kind of seems like, couldn't you just ask the native speaker to be clear about that, or ask them specifically for each correction? Because I think most native speakers do understand the difference. So if you explain to them the difference and just said, like, I want to be really clear which is which, kind of seems like they would be able to help you. But overall, what I would say is, when you're kind of learning to write in a foreign language, there's kind of 2 different phases that you go through. The first one is just learning to be able to write correctly without making obvious mistakes. Now, even a lot of native speakers regularly make mistakes. I'm not talking about they had a typo or something. I mean, there's a lot of native speakers consistently have there's mistakes that they make consistently. Like, there's some grammatical rule or some usage of a word that they just misunderstood or don't know, and so they consistently make mistakes. So it's not like every native speaker has the capacity to write perfectly, even on the level of just accuracy, with not even taking style into account. So there is that. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, there's these 2 phases, and the first phase is getting to the point where you're basically just able to write mostly correct. So yeah, you can still make some mistakes, because even native speakers make some mistakes, but for the most part, you can write grammatically using words in natural ways, and everything feels idiomatic. So it's just getting to the point where basically you seem like the average native when writing the language. And a lot of people, once they reach this point, then they'll be satisfied. But if you're motivated to, you can move on to the second phase, which is basically getting good as a writer in the target language, in the same way that a native speaker has to get good at writing in the target language, right? So people who are writers in general had to work, like even in their native language, had to work really hard to improve their writing ability and get to the point where they could write well enough to be a professional writer, whether they're, you know, a journalist or a nonfiction author or a fiction author or whatever. And so once you kind of get to the point where you're as good as like an average native speaker who's not particularly good at writing, then you want to basically think of yourself as a native speaker and think, what would I do in my native language if I wanted to become a professional writer and improve my writing ability? And I think you want to do those things. So it's basically this transition of going from thinking yourself as a learner of the language to basically just saying, well, I'm just a speaker of this language now, and I want to improve my writing. And I'm not really doing this as a language learner, I'm just doing this as a speaker of this language. And so in that case, there's a couple of different things that probably a lot of people do. First of all is just reading a ton, right? Reading a ton of the type of writing that you want to write yourself. That's probably the biggest thing that you can do. And the thing that everyone who gives advice on how to get good at writing says, right? It's input is king. So do tons of reading specifically in the style that you want to get better at writing at. That's what kind of trains your sensibilities. But also writing and getting feedback seems to also be a really important part of the process of getting good at writing. And so what I would do is try to find, is kind of do what you said, of try to find one or two native speakers and work really closely with them. So if you're having trouble finding a tutor, well, don't look for a tutor, look for a Chinese person who actually is a professional writer and works with other native Chinese speakers who want to be a professional writer, and work with them. So don't look for somebody who's like going to treat you as a second language learner. Look for somebody who's going to treat you like you're already a native speaker, and work with you in that fashion. And basically, yeah, what you want is somebody who will, give you feedback and help kind of point out what you're missing and how you can improve and things like that. And in this case, yeah, because style is such a subjective thing and there is no right or wrong, it really just comes down to finding a style that you like and finding somebody who writes in a style that you like and learning from them and kind of having them be your mentor in writing. So, yeah, that would be my advice. And in general, just Google and like look into like, how do you get good at writing? What advice do professional writers, what advice do professional writers have to aspiring writers in general, both in Chinese and in English, right? Because that's the type of stuff that you want to do. And yeah, so I know that's probably a little different than what you were asking, because you were like, how do I tell the difference between learner mistakes and other mistakes? But at this point, I mean, if you're good enough, then I would just say drop the whole idea of learner mistakes and just think of it all as a style, basically. I mean, if you take this advice that I'm giving and you find basically a professional writer who will mentor you, they'll tell you when you make a straight out mistake as well, right? Because they're going to be giving you probably very detailed feedback. And so you definitely want somebody who will tell you exactly, not just this is wrong, you should do it like this, but exactly why, right? Say the problem with the way that you did it is X and you could improve it by Y. So I keep hitting my mic because it's so close to my face. Yeah, and so sometimes the mistake might be you can't use this word in this way. It's just not grammatically correct. Whereas other times it might be, oh, this just doesn't sound elegant for this reason or whatever. So yeah, that would be my advice. So Anton asks, my question is about reviewing monolingual vocabulary cards. Bilingual cards are quick to review because I simply say the equivalent English word or two in my head. However, for monolingual cards, should I try to recall the whole monolingual definition in my head? What is your internal thought process when we're reviewing a monolingual card? Yeah, so I kind of have a video on this called sentence card versus vocab cards. And in that video, I actually talk about how I find that vocab cards are pretty awkward when you start using monolingual definitions. So for me, I like vocab cards before the monolingual transition, and then sentence cards after the monolingual transition, because yeah, it's kind of awkward to try to just recall the essence of a word. You definitely don't want to recall the whole monolingual definition because that's way too much work. Like your goal isn't to memorize a definition, it's to memorize the meaning of a word, and the definition is just one way of writing that meaning. And so if you're forcing yourself to recall the whole definition, that's going to take way too long and use way too much brain power, and it's not going to be a good use of time at all. So the important thing is you want to just recall the essence of what the word really means. And yeah, it is pretty awkward to do that. It's hard. I can't really do it very well. Some people seem to be able to do it really well, but and they love vocab cards. But for me personally, yeah, I think it's just kind of awkward to try to recall the essence of a word. Crap, hit my microphone again. To just recall the essence of the word without, like, yeah, having a sentence to understand or something. So one option is just start using sentence cards. That's kind of the direction I ended up going in. But otherwise, yeah, you just got to kind of come up with some way that you can just recall the essence of the word directly and confirm that you actually understood it. So Mr. Huberto asks, my target language is Spanish and I'm at about a level 3. Maybe he means stage 3, I'm not sure. I work as an EMT, so sometimes I have to speak to some of my patients that can't speak English. I know what I want to say in my head, but I feel like my tongue has a hard time forming words. How would you recommend overcoming this obstacle? Shadowing. Sounds like shadowing is the perfect exercise to help you out with that particular issue of, yeah, feeling like your tongue is just kind of caught and you can't form the words. Carson Pence asks, hey Matt, I'm wondering what you might recommend to somebody jumping ship from some kanji learning resource like WaniKani. If I've already learned around 1300 kanji, should I restart with something like RTK or the new Refold deck, or should I just jump straight into sentence mining with an emphasis on kanji? Yeah, you should definitely just jump into sentence mining, and you don't even need to have an emphasis on kanji at all. If you watch my video about the JP1K, I explain how in order to start sentence mining, all you need to do is reach a point that I call kanji fluency. And this is just a point where you can kind of remember a kanji just by looking at it. So one way to test whether you have kanji fluency or not is if I showed you if I showed you one kanji right now that you had never seen before in your life, and I just said, okay, see this kanji right here? Look at it for a couple seconds. And then I came to you a couple days later and I showed you 3 kanji, all of which you'd never seen before, besides one. And then I said, which of these 3 kanji is the one I showed you a couple days ago? If you could easily pass that test, then that means you have kanji fluency. It means just by looking at a kanji, you can kind of remember it. Maybe you don't remember all the strokes exactly. Maybe you don't remember the reading. Maybe you don't remember the meaning. But you can still realize that, oh yeah, that is that same kanji that I saw the other day. As long as you have that basic ability, then you can just continue to improve your kanji ability through learning whole words through sentence mining. Because as long as you have that ability of being able to like tell, oh yeah, I know this is the kanji that I saw the other day, then you'll be able to just memorize that, okay, when these 2 kanji are next to each other, it's read like X and it means Y. And now you know how to read that word. And so you can just continue to learn new words this way. And by the time you've learned a couple thousand words, you'll naturally start realizing that for most kanji that you can immediately recognize it and know what the different readings are and know what the different meanings are. So all those other abilities come about naturally as a result of learning thousands of words. So if you already have like formally learned over 1,000 kanji through WaniKani, then you're probably way past the point of kanji fluency. And so you definitely don't need to do RTK and you definitely don't need to do the JP1K. You just need to start sentence mining, and you don't even need to have an emphasis on kanji because you already have a much deeper foundation in kanji than most of the people who are doing the normal Refold path and they do the JP1K and then they go into sentence mining. So let's see, maybe 1 or 2 more questions here. So Anton asks, do you have any tips for switching over to using target language filler words when speaking? I find that when speaking Japanese, I sometimes subconsciously say things like or so when speaking. However, trying to say things like etto or ano feel forced and make me lose focus on what I'm trying to say. So what I'd say is you probably do want to very consciously start using fillers in your target language. And what I would do is, first of all, start paying attention to how fillers are used whenever you are immersing, because different fillers are used at different times and they have like slightly different feels to them. So first you want to get a good sense of like, okay, the type of speech that I want to adopt, what fillers are used in that type of speech and how are they used. You want to get a really good sense of that by specifically watching out for that in your immersion. And then when you speak yourself, you just want to consciously imitate it. And yeah, it might feel weird at first. I mean, it's kind of natural that to feel like it feels weird because A filler is something that in general in our native language we say unconsciously, right? It's just something that comes out. A lot of times it's not something that you would consciously choose to say, because like I've talked about in a previous Q&A, a lot of times saying no filler actually sounds better overall than saying a filler. So to consciously choose to say a filler itself is already kind of weird. But you need to do that when you're learning a target language at the beginning, because if you don't go through a period of consciously using fillers, then you never can get to the point where you use them subconsciously. And like I also talked about in Q&A, being able to subconsciously and naturally use fillers is crucial for being a good speaker of the language, because there's just going to be times where you need to sit and think about something for a moment. And if you just are completely silent during that time, then it's going to be really awkward. And if you say, that's like way worse than any native target language filler, right? So I would recommend, just consciously being aware that getting better at using target language fillers is something that you want to do. Pay attention to it in your immersion, and then actively use it yourself. Yeah, it will feel weird at the beginning, but very quickly you'll get used to it, and then it will just be something that you never have to think about, because it just happens automatically. So Joshua asks, hypothetically, if I had to learn a new language from scratch, but I was magically gifted with the ability to perfectly parse all the phonemes of the new language, how much faster could I learn it? I think probably a lot faster. And this is, I mean, I don't have any like real solid evidence I can point to, but I think that basically when you just think about how your brain is acquiring the language, it hears sounds, it sorts those sounds into, vowels and consonants, and then sorts those into syllables, and then sorts those into words, and then you have how words are interacting with one another, right? So if you can't hear the sounds of the language, then you can't acquire words, really, right? I mean, to a certain degree you can. I don't think you have to have perfect phoneme parsing ability to be able to acquire words. You definitely don't. But basically, if you could perfectly hear all the phonemes, then every single word that you hear pronounced, that word itself like fully made it into the language acquisition device, where your brain can start doing pattern recognition to try to figure out what words mean and how words are interacting to create the grammar and things like this. Whereas if you can't parse the phonemes, then, if you can't parse them at all, then first of all, you're not going to hear any words. And so your brain can't even get started on parsing what words mean and how the grammar works. But even, let's say you can like half hear them, well, then you're still, sometimes your brain's going to be able to identify words and start trying to figure out what things mean. But other times you're just going to be missing out, because maybe there's a word that you know or that you've heard before, but because your brain didn't fully parse the phonemes right, it thought it was a different word, or it just felt like, I don't know what I just heard. And because of that, basically your brain wasn't able to make use of that particular context, right? That context could have been kind of a reference point that your brain used to deepen its understanding of a word, but that opportunity was just lost because your brain you couldn't tell what word you actually heard. And so I think that, basically if you had perfect phoneme parsing ability, then your brain can make use of all the input you get so much more. Whereas what happens in reality when you're taking an input-based approach, or any approach really, is that your brain starts off working on developing the ability to parse the phonemes. And at the beginning, that's all it's doing, because like I said, if you can't parse the phonemes at all, then you can't identify any words. And so you're stuck. But once you have a basic ability to parse some of the phonemes, then you start doing this thing where your brain is working on deepening its ability to parse the phonemes and its ability to understand what words and understand the grammar, stuff like that, at the same time. And you don't get to the point of perfectly being able to parse phonemes until you're probably pretty far into the process. Most people probably never get to the point where they're literally perfect, but most people probably don't even get to like 95% until like a full year of doing immersion learning. And so if you had perfect ability to parse phonemes from the beginning, then you'd be able to just progress way faster. Learning words would be way easier because they'd sound really familiar to you, and your brain would be able to make use of the input so much faster. So I think that, it would make a huge difference if you could, right from the beginning, perfectly parse all the phonemes. And I kind of mentioned this at the beginning of the Q&A, but there's this technique called chorusing, which apparently, like I said, I'm still looking into it. So I'll share this much more with you guys when I feel like I have a more full, complete understanding of it. But it's a specific version of shadowing that basically allows you to acquire the phonetic system of the language pretty quickly potentially right from the beginning of the learning process. It does, like, generally what I've thought until now is that shadowing before you can parse the phonemes is kind of a waste of time, because if you can't hear something, then you're not going to be able to produce it. But in this specific form of shadowing called chorusing, you enter into this feedback loop where by trying to repeat back what you're hearing, you're actually not only just improving your pronunciation, but you're actually improving your perception, because it creates a way to deliberately practice the act of correctly perceiving your target language. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there, but I still have to look into it more to really fully understand it. But yeah, if there is a way to speed up the process of acquiring the phonetic system and speeding up the acquisition of the ability to parse the phonemes, that would be really valuable, and I think that could speed up the whole language acquisition process a lot. And so yeah, I'll make this last question. Kyle asks, how long do you recommend someone's condensed audio playlist to be for passive immersion? Mine is usually what feels to be too short, 4 or 5 condensed anime episodes of intense content. Or to rephrase the question, when would you consider it to be too short to the point it would be better to add free flow audio in? So what I like to do is basically switch out my passive immersion audio once a week. And I think for a 1 week period, probably between 1 to 4 hours of content would be good. If it's condensed, that's really good. If it's not condensed, that's fine. It doesn't really change the recommendation. But yeah, I think on the short end, 1 hour, if you really like that repetition, being able to hear the same thing over and over and over and get to the point where you can hear it a lot more clearly than you could before. Maybe 3-4 hours on the other end if, you know, things get too tedious for you and you just feel like you're going to go crazy if you listen to the same thing one more time because it's just like so repetitive. But yeah, that's probably the range that I would recommend for passive listening. But I don't think it matters too much. It really just try different things to see what keeps you the most engaged. That's probably what's going to make the biggest difference. So yeah, that's all the questions for this week. Thank you guys so much for your questions. Lots of good questions this week. Please, again, post all the questions that I didn't answer at the bottom. Post any new questions that you have. And thank you guys so much for supporting. Couldn't be doing this without you. Later, guys.